Behind the gilded doors of Kensington Palace, where centuries of royal tradition have played out in whispers and shadows, a moment of raw human emotion was about to shatter the carefully constructed facade of the British monarchy. On a gray Tuesday morning in November, Prince Alexander Edward Charles, second in line to the throne, would walk into a private meeting that would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his duty, and himself. What transpired in that oak-paneled room would leave the future king broken, betrayed, and facing an impossible choice that would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor that morning would be the last time Prince Alexander walked with the confidence of a man who believed in the institution he was born to lead. By the time he emerged 90 minutes later, tears streaming down his face and his hands trembling with emotion, the very foundation of his world had crumbled beneath his feet. This is the story of what happened when duty collided with truth, when family loyalty was tested by impossible circumstances, and when one man's breaking point became the catalyst for a royal crisis that no one saw coming. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Kensington Palace like a shroud, obscuring the carefully manicured gardens where Prince Alexander had played as a child. At 38, he still remembered every hidden path, every secret alcove where he had once imagined himself as a knight defending his kingdom. Now, as he walked the familiar corridors toward what he believed would be a routine family meeting, he carried the weight of real responsibilities that his childhood games had never prepared him for. Alexander paused outside the cupola room, adjusting his navy blazer and checking his watch, 9 o'clock precisely. Punctuality was not just a personal trait but a royal requirement, drilled into him since he could walk. His father, King Edward IX, had always said that being late was a form of disrespect that royalty could never afford. Through the heavy wooden doors he could hear the low murmur of familiar voices, his father, his uncle Prince Richard, and surprisingly, Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, the Queen's private secretary, whose presence at family meetings was unusual, but not unprecedented. The prince's mind wandered to the previous evening's conversation with his wife. She had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her salmon while their 2 children chattered about their upcoming school play. When he had asked if everything was all right, she had simply nodded and said she hoped the meeting would go well. Something in her tone had struck him as odd, but between his official duties and the constant demands of royal life, he had dismissed it as another case of the stress they all lived under. Alexander straightened his shoulders and knocked twice before entering. The room fell silent as he stepped inside, and immediately he sensed something was wrong. His father sat behind the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to Queen Victoria, his face grave and aged in a way Alexander hadn't noticed before. Uncle Richard stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, refusing to meet his nephew's eyes. Sir Geoffrey held a leather portfolio, his usually composed demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. "Alexander, please sit down," his father said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. The formality in the king's voice was unmistakable. This was not a casual family gathering. As he settled into the chair, Alexander noticed the documents spread across the desk, official seals, letterheads from various government departments, and what appeared to be photographs. His stomach tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. "I'm afraid we have a rather serious matter to discuss," King Edward began, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of royal duty. "Something has come to light that affects not just our family, but the very institution of the monarchy itself." Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, opening his portfolio with practiced precision. "Your Royal Highness, we received these documents 3 days ago through unofficial channels. We have verified their authenticity through multiple sources." He placed a series of photographs on the desk, arranging them like evidence in a courtroom. Alexander leaned forward, his heart beginning to race as he recognized the images. They were surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough to make out faces and locations. His breath caught in his throat as he saw himself in several of the pictures. But these were not recent photographs. They were from nearly 20 years ago, from a time in his life he had worked hard to forget. "We need to discuss your relationship with Marcus Thornfield," his father said quietly. The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Marcus Thornfield. Brilliant, charismatic, dangerous Marcus Thornfield. The investigative journalist who had been found dead in his London flat 15 years ago, his death ruled as suicide by a coroner's court that had asked surprisingly few questions. The man who had once meant everything to Alexander, before duty and expectation had forced him to choose between his heart and his crown. "I don't understand," Alexander managed, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "Marcus died years ago. What could this possibly have to do with anything now?" Uncle Richard finally turned from the window, his face etched with disappointment. "Alexander, we know about the letters. We know about the meetings. We know about the investigation Marcus was conducting into arms sales to foreign governments, arms sales that involved several members of parliament and, according to these documents, at least one member of our family. The room seemed to spin around Alexander as the implications became clear. Marcus had been investigating corruption at the highest levels of government, and their relationship had put Alexander in an impossible position. But Marcus was dead, had been dead for 15 years. How could any of this matter now? Sir Geoffrey placed another document on the desk, a letter written in Alexander's own handwriting. It was addressed to Marcus, dated just 2 weeks before the journalist's death. In it, Alexander had begged Marcus to abandon his investigation, warning him that he was playing with forces beyond his understanding. The letter contained details about government meetings, about conversations Alexander had overheard, about the very real danger Marcus was placing himself in by pursuing his story. "Where did you get this?" Alexander whispered, recognizing his younger self's desperate handwriting. "The same source that provided the surveillance photographs," his father replied. "Someone who was apparently very close to Mr. Thornfield and has been sitting on this information for 15 years. Someone who has now decided to come forward." The king leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "Alexander, I need you to tell us exactly what happened between you and Marcus Thornfield. I need to know everything about your relationship with him, everything you knew about his investigation, and everything you may have told him about matters of state security." Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. For 15 years, he had carried the guilt of Marcus's death, wondering if his warnings had somehow contributed to his friend's despair, if the pressure of choosing between love and duty had driven Marcus to take his own life. Now, faced with evidence of their relationship and the dangerous game they had both been playing, he realized that the truth was far more complicated and potentially devastating than he had ever imagined. "I loved him," Alexander said finally, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "I loved Marcus Thornfield, and I believe that love may have gotten him killed." The admission hung in the air, and for the first time since entering the room, Alexander saw his father's composure crack. King Edward's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water, and Uncle Richard moved closer to the desk as if preparing to physically support his brother. "Tell us everything," the king said quietly. "Start from the beginning and leave nothing out. The survival of this monarchy may depend on what you tell us in the next hour." As Alexander began to speak, reliving memories he had spent 15 years trying to forget, he had no idea that in exactly 90 minutes he would be walking out of this room with his entire world destroyed. Finally understanding the true cost of the secrets that powerful families keep, Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to recount the story that would unravel everything he thought he knew about truth, loyalty, and the price of silence. The autumn of 2008 seemed like another lifetime now, a period when he had been young enough to believe that love could conquer duty, naive enough to think that royal privilege could protect the people he cared about from the machinery of state power. "I met Marcus at Oxford," Alexander began, his eyes fixed on his hands folded in his lap. "Not while I was a student. This was later, during a lecture series on investigative journalism that I attended in my capacity as patron of the Press Freedom Foundation. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He had this way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of any issue, no matter how people tried to deflect or obfuscate." King Edward listened without interruption, his face a mask of royal composure that Alexander had seen countless times during state functions. But there was something different in his father's eyes now, a wariness that spoke of a man who had spent decades protecting secrets and was now watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "The initial attraction was intellectual," Alexander continued, remembering the electric feeling of meeting someone who challenged him, who didn't simply agree with everything he said because of his title. "Marcus didn't care that I was a prince. If anything, it made him more skeptical of everything I said. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was having real conversations about things that mattered." Sir Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly struggling with the implications of what he was hearing. As the Queen's private secretary, he had spent his entire career managing crises and protecting the royal family's reputation. This conversation was venturing into territory that made damage control seem impossible. "When did the relationship become personal?" Uncle Richard asked carefully, his diplomatic training evident in the way he chose his words. Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from shame about his feelings for Marcus, but from the knowledge of how his family would receive this information. 6 months after we met, we were both attending a conference on press ethics in Edinburgh. Marcus had given a presentation on government transparency that was absolutely devastating to several cabinet ministers. Afterward, we went for drinks, and he paused, searching for words that could convey the intensity of what had developed between them without causing his father to completely shut down. "We spent the night together," Alexander said simply. "And many nights after that over the course of the next 18 months. I fell in love with him, and I believe he loved me too, though he was always careful to maintain some distance because of my position." The silence that followed was deafening. King Edward's face had gone pale, and Uncle Richard was staring out the window again, as if he could make this entire conversation disappear through sheer force of will. "Did you discuss matters of state with him?" Sir Geoffrey asked, his voice professional despite the gravity of the question. "Did you share information that could have compromised national security or government operations?" This was the question Alexander had been dreading, the one that would force him to confront the full magnitude of his mistakes. "Not initially," he said carefully. "Marcus was scrupulous about not asking me about anything that could be considered confidential. But as our relationship deepened, and as his investigation into government corruption began to uncover serious wrongdoing, the lines became blurred." He stood and walked to the window where Uncle Richard was standing, needing the physical movement to help him process the memories that were flooding back. "In early 2009, Marcus told me he was investigating a series of arms deals between British manufacturers and several foreign governments. He had discovered that these deals were being facilitated through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, and that the profits were being shared among a select group of politicians and businessmen." Alexander turned back to face his father. "He showed me documents, financial records, communication intercepts." The scope of what he had uncovered was staggering. "We're talking about billions of pounds in illegal arms sales, money that was being used to fund private militias and destabilize entire regions of Africa and the Middle East." King Edward's composure finally cracked completely. "Alexander, please tell me you didn't—" "I confirmed some of what he suspected," Alexander interrupted, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "I didn't give him classified information, but I confirmed that certain government ministers were indeed involved in the activities he was investigating. I thought I was helping him expose corruption that needed to be stopped." The room erupted in barely controlled chaos. Uncle Richard began pacing, muttering under his breath about disasters and constitutional crises. Sir Geoffrey was frantically taking notes, already calculating the political fallout. King Edward simply sat in stunned silence, staring at his son as if seeing him for the first time. "There's more," Alexander said quietly, and the room fell silent again. "Marcus discovered that one of the key facilitators of these arms deals was someone with direct access to the royal family, someone who was using their position to provide intelligence about government policy and diplomatic initiatives to help time the arms sales for maximum profit." He walked back to the desk and picked up one of the surveillance photographs. This picture was taken outside Marcus's flat 3 days before he died. I had gone there to beg him to stop his investigation. I had started receiving warnings, anonymous phone calls, threatening letters sent to my private residence. Someone was watching us, and they wanted me to know it. Alexander's voice broke as he continued. "I told Marcus that he was in danger, that the people he was investigating wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently. I begged him to destroy his research and leave London. We argued about it for hours. He said he couldn't abandon the story because too many people would die if these arms sales continued." The prince sat back down heavily, the weight of 15 years of guilt crushing down on him. "The last thing I said to him was that he had to choose between his story and his life. I told him that I couldn't protect him if he continued, that my family's position made it impossible for me to intervene if something happened to him." "And what did he say?" King Edward asked quietly. "He said he understood and that he loved me enough to let me go. He said he would rather die knowing he had tried to do the right thing than live knowing he had been silent while people suffered." Alexander's voice was barely audible now. 3 days later, he was found dead in his flat. The coroner ruled it suicide, but Marcus would never have killed himself. He was murdered, and I've known that for 15 years. Sir Geoffrey looked up from his notes. "Your Royal Highness, who was the royal family member involved in these arms deals? Who was providing the inside information?" Alexander met his father's eyes, seeing the fear and resignation there. "I don't know for certain," he said. "Marcus died before he could tell me. But I've spent 15 years wondering, 15 years watching every family gathering and every state function, wondering which person at the table was responsible for Marcus's death." The king stood slowly, moving to a portrait of Queen Victoria that hung on the far wall. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of royal tradition and the burden of secrets that had been passed down through generations. "Alexander," he said without turning around, "what you don't understand is that the investigation into those arms deals didn't end with Marcus Thornfield's death. It was taken over by MI6, and it led to the exposure and prosecution of 3 cabinet ministers and 14 businessmen, The royal family member who was involved was identified and quietly removed from any position where they could access sensitive information. Alexander felt his world tilt on its axis. You knew? You've known all along? King Edward turned back to his son, and for the first time, Alexander saw tears in his father's eyes. We knew about the investigation. We knew about Marcus's death. And we knew about your relationship with him. What we didn't know until 3 days ago was that someone had documented everything, that someone had been watching and recording and waiting 15 years to use that information against us. The truth hit Alexander like a physical blow. His family had known about Marcus, had known about the investigation, had known about the corruption, and they had done nothing to save the man he loved. They had let Marcus die to protect a family secret, and they had let Alexander live with the guilt for 15 years. Who? Alexander whispered. Who was it? Which member of our family was involved? The answer, when it came, would destroy everything Alexander believed about honor, duty, and the people he had trusted his entire life, and it would make his decision about what to do next the most important choice he would ever make. The silence stretched between father and son like a chasm that 15 years of unspoken truth had carved into their relationship. King Edward moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk, withdrawing a manila folder marked with official seals and classification stamps. His hands, Alexander noticed, were trembling slightly as he placed the folder on the desk between them. Before I answer your question, the king said heavily, you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Sir Geoffrey, please show Alexander the communication we received 3 days ago. Sir Geoffrey produced a tablet from his briefcase, its screen displaying an encrypted email that bore no identifying information about its sender. This arrived through a secure channel that took considerable technical sophistication to establish, he explained. The sender claims to have been Marcus Thornfield's research partner and has been in possession of all his files since his death. Alexander took the tablet with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The email was brief but devastating in its implications. Your Majesty, for 15 years I have honored Marcus Thornfield's final request to protect the evidence he gathered about arms-dealing corruption within the British government and royal family. However, recent events have convinced me that silence is no longer an option. The same networks that ordered Marcus's death are active again, and innocent lives are at stake. I possess complete documentation of the investigation, including recorded conversations, financial records, and photographic evidence of meetings between government officials and arms dealers. I also have extensive documentation of Prince Alexander's relationship with Marcus and the information sharing that occurred between them. I am prepared to release all of this information to international media outlets unless the royal family takes immediate action to address the ongoing corruption and publicly acknowledges Marcus Thornfield's death as murder, not suicide. You have 72 hours to respond. The countdown began when you opened this email. A friend of Truth Alexander read the email twice, his mind struggling to process the implications. Marcus had a research partner? Who? We don't know, Uncle Richard replied, his voice strained. Marcus was careful about protecting his sources. What we do know is that this person has been sitting on enough evidence to destroy the monarchy and bring down the current government. They could have used this information at any time over the past 15 years, but they waited. The question is why now? King Edward opened the manila folder and withdrew a series of documents. These are transcripts of conversations that were apparently recorded without the participants' knowledge. Some of them involve Marcus Thornfield. Others, he hesitated, his composure cracking again. Others involve your uncle. Alexander's blood turned to ice as he looked at Uncle Richard, who was now standing rigidly by the window like a man facing a firing squad. Richard? Not Uncle Richard, King Edward said quietly. Your other uncle. Marcus's investigation identified Prince James as the royal family member who was providing inside information to arms dealers. The words hit Alexander like a physical assault. Prince James, his father's younger brother, had been killed in a skiing accident in Switzerland 8 years ago. He had been the family member Alexander had always felt closest to, the one who had understood his struggles with royal duty and had encouraged his charitable work with press freedom organizations. That's impossible, Alexander said, his voice hollow. James would never have been involved in something like that. He spent his entire adult life working on humanitarian causes. Sir Geoffrey placed another document on the desk, a bank statement showing deposits of nearly £2 million into an account registered to Prince James. The deposits correspond exactly with the timing of 3 major arms deals that Marcus was investigating. Your uncle was receiving approximately 10% of the profits from each transaction. Alexander stared at the evidence, feeling his understanding of his family's history crumble around him. How long did you know about this? We suspected James was involved shortly after Marcus's death, King Edward admitted. The investigation that MI6 took over confirmed it 6 months later, But James died before we could confront him directly about it. Died or was killed? Alexander asked, the question hanging in the air like an accusation. Uncle Richard turned from the window, his face gray with strain. The skiing accident was investigated thoroughly by Swiss authorities. There was no evidence of foul play. But you suspected it wasn't an accident, Alexander pressed. King Edward nodded slowly. We suspected that James's death was connected to his involvement in the arms-dealing network. Either he was killed to silence him, or he killed himself rather than face exposure. We never found definitive proof either way. Alexander stood and began pacing, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was learning. So Marcus died because he was investigating arms-dealing corruption. Uncle James died because he was part of that corruption. And I've been living with guilt about Marcus's death for 15 years, while you knew the truth about what had really happened. We protected you, King Edward said firmly. If you had known the truth about James, if you had known that your relationship with Marcus had exposed a family member's criminal activity, you would have been destroyed by it. We thought it was better to let you believe that Marcus's death was unrelated to the investigation. You let me think that I had somehow contributed to his suicide. Alexander exploded, his royal composure finally shattering completely. Do you have any idea what that guilt has done to me? Do you understand how it has affected every relationship I've had, every decision I've made for the past 15 years? The room fell silent except for the sound of Alexander's heavy breathing. He realized that tears were streaming down his face, 15 years of suppressed grief and anger, finally finding expression. There's something else, Sir Geoffrey said quietly, consulting his tablet again. The email we received included a specific demand. The sender wants the royal family to publicly acknowledge Marcus Thornfield's death as murder and to issue a formal apology for the family's role in the arms-dealing corruption. They also want Prince James's involvement to be made public, despite his death. Alexander wiped his eyes and tried to regain some composure. And if we don't comply, then they release everything, Uncle Richard said. The recordings, the photographs, the financial documents, the evidence of your relationship with Marcus, all of it goes to every major news organization in the world simultaneously. The monarchy wouldn't survive the scandal. King Edward leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 73 years. Alexander, we need you to help us understand what we're dealing with. Who could Marcus have trusted with this information? Who would have had the ability to keep it secret for 15 years and the technical knowledge to contact us through encrypted channels? Alexander thought back to his conversations with Marcus, trying to remember details about the journalist's professional relationships and personal life. Marcus was paranoid about his sources, he said slowly. He never told me specific names, but he mentioned having a contact inside the intelligence community. Someone who was helping him verify the information he was gathering. MI5 or MI6? Sir Geoffrey asked. He never said. But this person was someone Marcus trusted completely. Someone who shared his commitment to exposing corruption no matter the personal cost. Alexander paused, a memory surfacing. Marcus told me once that this person was someone who understood what it was like to have loyalty divided between personal conscience and institutional duty. He said it was someone who had been forced to make impossible choices. Uncle Richard and Sir Geoffrey exchanged glances. That could describe any number of people in the intelligence community, Richard said. Or it could describe someone else entirely. There's one more thing, Alexander said, remembering a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Marcus told me that his partner in the investigation was someone who had lost family members to conflicts fueled by illegal arms sales, someone who had personal reasons for wanting to expose the network. King Edward closed the manila folder and looked directly at his son. Alexander, whoever this person is, they have the power to destroy everything our family has built over centuries. They can expose not just the arms-dealing corruption, but your relationship with Marcus, the family's knowledge of the crimes, and our decision to cover up the truth about James's involvement. The question we need to answer is simple. Do we give in to their demands and destroy the monarchy ourselves, or do we find another way to handle this crisis? Alexander looked around the room at the three men who had shaped his understanding of duty and service his entire life. For the first time, he realized that they were not the guardians of honor and truth he had believed them to be, but rather the protectors of secrets and lies that had cost innocent lives. I need to know exactly what you're asking me to do, Alexander said quietly. Because whatever decision we make in the next few hours, I will not be responsible for any more deaths. I will not let anyone else pay the price for this family's secrets. The answer to that question would force Alexander to choose between the institution he had been born to serve and the truth that Marcus Thornfield had died trying to expose. And it would determine whether the monarchy could survive the revelation of crimes that reached to its very heart. The grandfather clock in the corner of the cupola room chimed 10:30, marking the passage of an hour and a half that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Alexander's life. As the sound faded, he found himself staring at the portrait of Queen Victoria, wondering if she had ever faced decisions that required choosing between the survival of the monarchy and basic human decency. "Before we discuss our options," Sir Geoffrey said, consulting his notes, "there's additional information that arrived this morning." He produced another tablet, this one displaying a series of recent news articles. The sender of the email wasn't bluffing about ongoing corruption in arms-dealing networks. 3 investigative journalists in different countries have been murdered in the past 6 months, all while researching connections between European governments and illegal weapons sales to conflict zones. Alexander felt his stomach drop as he scanned the headlines. A French journalist found dead in her Paris apartment, ruled a burglary gone wrong. A German reporter who died in a suspicious car accident while investigating defense contracts. A British freelancer whose body had been discovered in the Thames just 2 weeks ago, his death still under investigation. "They're killing journalists again," Alexander said, his voice barely audible. "The same network that murdered Marcus is still operating." King Edward nodded grimly. "Which explains why Marcus's research partner has chosen to come forward now. They're not just threatening us for revenge, they're trying to prevent more murders by forcing the truth into the open." Uncle Richard moved to the desk and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Edward, we need to consider our options carefully. If we acknowledge Marcus Thornfield's death as murder and admit to James's involvement, we're not just damaging the monarchy. We're potentially compromising ongoing intelligence operations and putting other people at risk." "What ongoing operations?" Alexander demanded, sensing there was still more he wasn't being told. Sir Geoffrey hesitated before answering. "After Marcus's death, MI6 established a long-term operation to infiltrate and monitor the arms-dealing network. Over the past 15 years, they prevented dozens of illegal weapons shipments and gathered intelligence that has been shared with international law enforcement. If we publicly expose the network's connection to Prince James, we could compromise agents who were still working undercover." Alexander felt a surge of rage that surprised him with its intensity. "So we're supposed to protect intelligence operations that were built on Marcus's murder? We're supposed to let his death remain officially listed as suicide so that MI6 can continue their work?" "It's not that simple," King Edward said quietly. "The intelligence gathered through this operation has prevented conflicts that could have killed thousands of people. The weapons shipments they've intercepted would have fueled wars in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and a dozen other places where civilians are already suffering. Then find another way to continue the operation," Alexander shouted, his composure finally completely shattered. "Find another way that doesn't require us to dishonor Marcus's memory and protect the people who killed him." The room fell silent, and Alexander realized that everyone was staring at him. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger and grief that had been building for 15 years. For the first time in his adult life, he had raised his voice to the King of England, and he found that he didn't care about the breach of protocol. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat carefully. "There is another option. One that might satisfy both the sender's demands for truth and the intelligence community's need for operational security." All eyes turned to the private secretary, who seemed to be choosing his words with extreme care. "We could arrange for the truth about Marcus Thornfield's death to be revealed through a controlled leak to a trusted journalist. Someone who could tell the story in a way that exposes the corruption and honors Marcus's memory without compromising ongoing operations." "And what about James?" Alexander asked. "What about the family's knowledge of the crimes?"
What about the 15 years of cover-up?
We could frame it as a royal family investigation that uncovered the truth about Prince James's involvement after his death.
Uncle Richard suggested.
"We could say that the family has been working with intelligence services to bring the criminals to justice, but that operational security prevented us from speaking publicly until now." Alexander stared at his uncle in disbelief. "You want to create another cover story? You want to turn Marcus's murder into a public relations opportunity?" King Edward stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gardens where Alexander had played as a child. "Alexander, I understand your anger. I understand your pain. But we have responsibilities that extend beyond our personal feelings. The monarchy serves a function in this country that goes beyond any individual member of the royal family. If we destroy the institution to satisfy our conscience, we damage something that provides stability and continuity for 67 million people. And if we don't tell the truth," Alexander replied, "we let Marcus's killers continue to operate with impunity. We let more journalists die. We become complicit in the very corruption that Marcus died trying to expose." The prince walked to the desk and picked up one of the surveillance photographs showing him and Marcus together outside a London restaurant. They had been happy that night, he remembered. It was Marcus's birthday, and they had celebrated at a small Italian place where no one recognized either of them. Marcus had laughed at something Alexander had said, his face bright with joy and affection. It was one of the last times they had been together before the threat started. "I'm going to ask you a direct question," Alexander said, still looking at the photograph. "And I want a direct answer. Did our family have any advanced knowledge of the plan to murder Marcus Thornfield?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Alexander felt something break inside him, some fundamental faith in the people who had shaped his entire understanding of duty and honor. King Edward's voice was barely audible when he finally spoke. "We knew that Marcus's investigation was putting him in danger. We knew that the people he was investigating had killed before. We were advised that his safety could not be guaranteed if he continued his work." Advised by whom? By people whose job it is to protect national security interests. Alexander turned to face his father directly. "Did they ask you to convince me to stop Marcus's investigation?" Another silence, another devastating confirmation. "They knew about our relationship," Alexander continued, the pieces falling into place. "They knew that I might be able to influence Marcus to abandon his investigation. And you agreed to let them use our family's knowledge of my personal life as leverage." King Edward's composure cracked completely. "Alexander, we thought we could protect both of you. We thought that if Marcus stopped his investigation, he would be safe, and you would be safe, and the intelligence services could handle the arms-dealing network through other means." "But Marcus wouldn't stop," Alexander said, understanding flooding through him. "So they killed him anyway, and you let them do it because you thought it was better than having the royal family exposed as part of the corruption network." Uncle Richard stepped forward as if to say something, but Alexander held up a hand to stop him. He needed to think, needed to process the full magnitude of what he had learned about his family's complicity in Marcus's death. The sender of the encrypted email was right. The royal family needed to take responsibility for their role in the arms-dealing corruption and the murder of an innocent journalist. But Sir Geoffrey was also right that exposing the truth could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and potentially lead to more violence. Alexander looked around the room one more time, seeing his father, his uncle, and the private secretary who had spent their entire careers protecting the monarchy from exactly this kind of crisis. For the first time in his life, he realized that his duty as a prince might be incompatible with his obligations as a human being. "I need some time to think," he said quietly. "I need to understand what my options are before I decide what I'm going to do." "Alexander," King Edward said carefully, "whatever you're considering, please remember that your decision will affect not just our family, but the stability of the entire constitutional system. The monarchy's survival may depend on how we handle the next few hours." Alexander walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Father, what you don't seem to understand is that I no longer care about the monarchy's survival. I care about doing what Marcus would have wanted me to do. I care about honoring his memory and making sure that his death meant something." As he opened the door to leave, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find Marcus's research partner, and together they were going to make sure that the truth about Marcus Thornfield's murder was told in a way that would prevent anyone else from paying the price for the monarchy's secrets. But first, he had one more conversation to have. One that would force him to confront the final, most devastating truth about the night Marcus died. Alexander walked through the corridors of Kensington Palace with the strange sensation that he was seeing everything for the last time. The portraits of his ancestors, the ornate furnishings, the symbols of centuries of royal power, they all felt like relics from someone else's life. In the space of 2 hours, his understanding of his family, his duty, and his own identity had been completely shattered. He found himself standing outside the blue drawing room, where a secure telephone line provided direct communication with intelligence services. For 15 years, he had wondered about the details of Marcus's final days, but he had never had the clearance or the courage to ask direct questions. Now, with everything already destroyed, he had nothing left to lose. The call was answered on the first ring by a voice he recognized, Sir James Morrison, Deputy Director of MI6, a man who had attended state functions and royal weddings throughout Alexander's adult life. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been expecting your call. I want to know exactly what happened to Marcus Thornfield." Alexander said without preamble. "I want to know who killed him, how it was done, and what role my family played in covering it up." There was a pause before Morrison responded. "Sir, I think it would be better if we had this conversation in person. Some things are too sensitive for telephone communication." "I'm not leaving this palace until I have answers," Alexander said firmly. "Marcus's research partner has given us less than 24 hours to respond to their demands. And I need to know everything before I decide what I'm going to do. Another pause, longer this time. Very well. Marcus Thornfield was killed on March 15, 2009, at approximately 11:30 p.m. in his flat in Bloomsbury. The method was a staged overdose of prescription medications that he had been taking for anxiety. The scene was arranged to look like suicide, complete with a note written in his handwriting. Alexander felt his legs give way, and he sank into a chair beside the telephone. You're telling me that our intelligence services murdered him? I'm telling you that a decision was made at the highest levels of government that Marcus Thornfield's investigation posed an unacceptable threat to national security, Morrison replied carefully. The arms-dealing network he was investigating included members of parliament, senior military officials, and intelligence personnel from multiple countries. Exposing it would have compromised ongoing operations and potentially led to the collapse of several allied governments. So you killed him? We made a choice between one journalist's life and the lives of thousands of people who would have died if those arms-dealing networks had been exposed before we could neutralize them properly. Alexander closed his eyes, trying to process the casual way Morrison was describing Marcus's murder as a strategic decision. And my family knew about this? Your father was briefed on the situation and agreed that Marcus Thornfield's investigation could not be allowed to continue. The royal family's cooperation was essential to ensuring that you would not interfere with the operation. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. You used my relationship with Marcus as leverage. You threatened to expose us both unless my family cooperated with his murder. We used the information available to us to achieve the best possible outcome for national security interests, Morrison said. Your father understood that sometimes impossible choices have to be made to protect the greater good. Alexander felt something snap inside him, some final thread of loyalty to the institution he had served his entire life. Who was Marcus's research partner? Who has been sitting on his evidence for 15 years? The silence that followed told Alexander that he had finally asked the right question. Sir James, he pressed. Who was working with Marcus Thornfield? Someone who was in a position to observe the decision-making process firsthand, Morrison said finally. Someone who watched the machinery of state power destroy an innocent man and has been carrying that knowledge ever since. Alexander felt his heart stop as the implication became clear. Someone inside the intelligence services? Someone who was present when the order was given to eliminate Marcus Thornfield. Someone who has been waiting 15 years for the right moment to expose the truth. The phone slipped from Alexander's hand as he realized what Morrison was telling him. Marcus's research partner wasn't just someone who had access to his files. It was someone who had been inside the room when the decision was made to kill him. Someone who had watched Alexander's family cooperate with that decision and had been planning their revenge ever since. Alexander picked up the phone again, his voice hoarse with emotion. Are you telling me that someone in MI6 has been planning to destroy my family for 15 years? I'm telling you that the decision to eliminate Marcus Thornfield created enemies within our own organization, Morrison replied. People who believed that protecting arms dealers was not worth the cost of murdering journalists. People who have been waiting for the right moment to expose what really happened. Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline where Marcus had lived and died. What do they want? What will it take to satisfy them? They want the same thing Marcus wanted, Morrison said quietly. They want the truth about the arms-dealing corruption to be exposed. They want the people responsible to be held accountable. And they want Marcus Thornfield to be held accountable. And they want Marcus Thornfield to be remembered as the hero he was made to appear to be. And if we refuse, then they release everything. The recordings of the meetings where your father agreed to cooperate with Marcus's murder, the evidence of the arms-dealing network's current operations, the documentation of how the royal family has been complicit in covering up international crimes for 15 years. Alexander felt tears running down his face again, but this time they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage. How many other journalists have been killed to protect this network? Enough, Morrison said simply. Far too many. Alexander made his decision in that moment, standing in the blue drawing room where generations of his family had made choices about war and peace, life and death, truth and deception. He was going to honor Marcus's memory by doing what Marcus would have wanted him to do, regardless of the cost to his family or the monarchy. Sir James, he said into the phone, I want you to deliver a message to Marcus's research partner. Tell them that Prince Alexander is prepared to cooperate fully with exposing the truth about Marcus Thornfield's murder and the arms-dealing corruption. Tell them that I want to meet with them personally to discuss how we can honor Marcus's memory while minimizing the harm to innocent people. Sir, are you certain about this course of action? Once you begin this process, there will be no way to reverse it. Your family's reputation, the monarchy's survival, your own future, all of it will be at risk. Alexander thought about Marcus's laugh, about his passion for truth and justice, about the way he had died alone and afraid because powerful people had decided that his life was expendable. Tell him I'll meet them wherever they choose. Tell him I'm ready to finish what Marcus started. As he hung up the phone, Alexander realized that he had just committed himself to a path that would either redeem 15 years of lies and cowardice or destroy everything his family had built over centuries. Either way, he would finally be able to look at himself in the mirror and know that he had chosen truth over comfort, justice over survival, love over duty. He walked back toward the cupola room, where his father and uncle were waiting for his decision. In a few minutes, he would tell them that he was prepared to sacrifice the monarchy to honor the memory of a murdered journalist. He would tell them that some principles were more important than institutional survival, and that some truths were worth any price. As he reached for the door handle, Alexander felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in 15 years, he was about to do something that would make Marcus proud. The tears that had been streaming down his face when he left this room were tears of grief and rage. The tears he would shed when he returned would be tears of redemption. The shocking moment when Prince Alexander exited that private meeting in tears was not just the breakdown of a man confronting impossible truths about his family's crimes. It was the birth of someone willing to sacrifice everything for justice, someone ready to prove that love could indeed conquer duty, even 15 years too late. In choosing to expose the truth about Marcus Thornfield's murder, Alexander was choosing a path from which there truly would be no going back. But for the first time since that terrible night in 2009, he was choosing a path that would let him sleep peacefully, knowing that he had finally done the right thing. The monarchy might not survive what was coming, but Marcus's memory would be redeemed, and the people responsible for his death would finally face justice. For Alexander, that was a trade worth making, no matter the cost.